He's like a butterfly flapping his wings deep down in the forest, man. It's gonna cause a tree fall like 5,000 miles away, man. There ain't nobody seeing nobody. Man, see, like, you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got like that, man. That's the wind, man. Or like the dang old candle, man. It don't matter, man. It's like these old things.
All right, Thomas, welcome back to the Jay Burden Show. How you doing, man?
I'm doing very well. Thanks for hosting me, as always.
Yeah, so we're launching a little bit of a series here, and you and I on Radio Free Chicago, our current event show, have spoken multiple times about the Epstein scandal, right? Mostly we've kept our remarks to the political and theoretical, right? Epstein as a sort of discrediting incident for our regime and MAGA writ large. And I don't remember if this was on air or not, you and I had been kicking around discussing sort of the phenomenon of, I guess you would say, elite occultism and sexual abuse, right? Because this comes up more than once. It's not like Epstein was just this, one-off Jeffrey Dahmer type, right? Guy cracked in the head. And so I'll throw it to you, but I just wanted to say that we are going to be looking at a broader trend than just one guy, right? This is something that pops up elsewhere and is worth discussing because it sort of illustrates a certain, I guess, feature of both our ruling class and, ruling class in decadent empires such as ours.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people misinterpret the phenomenon, like what Epstein represents. He's neither an isolated case of a man pursuing deviant antics, for his own pleasure, nor is he just some sort of extortionist / fixer whose role was sort of corral powerful men into compromising positions. I mean, don't get me wrong; those aspects were present in what he was doing, but that wasn't the primary catalyst for these activities. And people in America kind of misunderstand religiosity. I'm not suggesting in terms of piety or in terms of how individuals worship, or I'm not presenting some sort of critique of the culture as not being adequately godly. I'm not talking about that. I'm saying, like, as an anthropological and social phenomenon, people don't really understand religiosity, and the reason why, and I agree with what you suggested before we went live. We'll spin this off on like a dedicated episode. I won't take us down this tangential path too deeply, but the reason why I take the book by Maury Terry so seriously, for those who don't know, he was this investigative journalist who wrote about the occult and occult practices, and specifically how it related to the Son of Sam case and those murders. Terry recognized early on that these homicides had the trappings of human sacrifice. And they did. That was the whole point. And I make the point again and again to people. It doesn't matter if you think occult belief structures are ridiculous or stupid. That's not the point. People actually do believe in these things. And even people who partake of these things, who may not literally believe in divine intelligences, communicating with them, or even people don't believe that by way of, ritualistic practices that one can access, intelligences of an alien or non-human character or essence. Even people don't believe in those kinds of things literally. They'll often they often are attracted to the trappings of power that occult practices convey, even if only superficially. And traditionally, prior to the Christianity kind of civilizing the West as we know it, and prior to Islam kind of conquering the Orient, religiosity, it traditionally kind of took two forms, okay? There was, kind of like the official state religion that tended to, center around, cultural learning and, social morality of the kind that could be interpreted and was intelligible to the majority of the population, and stuff that kind of had like a symbolic psychological significance, within discrete cultures. That's kind of the way to look at like, Greek city states and the Peloponnese, like having like patron gods and goddesses and things. But there was a deeper esotericism that kind of represented the real religiosity. And one of the functions of it was to separate rulers from the ruled. One of the most like striking examples of this is in ancient Egypt. The pharaoh and his, people make much of the luridness of that culture. Brothers and sisters would literally marry each other within the royal family. Tutankhamun he was horribly diseased. And he died when he was only about 20 years old because his parents almost certainly were a brother and a sister. Because the ancient Egyptians believed like they were literally gods. Their forebears were gods. So if I'm a pharaoh or part of the royal lineage, like me having sex with my sister, there's nothing wrong with that because we transcend humanity and these kinds of mere mortal ethics and things, and the understanding is that not being bound by by the conventions of morality that impact humans like mere mortals, is one of the things that's characteristic of a god race of overlords. Okay. Now, of course, that collapses on itself, and I am fairly confident one of the reasons why there was this kind of slow decline into decadence and then absolute decrepitude in Egypt, because if the pharaoh and his consort are giving birth to literal monsters, that suggests something catastrophic, about the fate of the race. But distilled down, there's a paganism also practiced by common people that owes a lot, in my opinion, to epigenetic memory. The idea of human sacrifice, okay? I realize I'm jumping around a bit, but I will tie this together. Obviously, one of the key functions that's described in the Bible is when God demands that human sacrifice be ended. Okay. Now, human sacrifice is universal to human cultures, and nobody can really explain why. You have these cultural anthropologists, and you have these old philologists in Europe, and in the first half of the 20th century and stuff. And today, you know, you have these kind of comparative anthropologists. They're like, well, it's, you know, an effort to control events within man's environment, and you know, the spectacle of bloodshed is awesome and fascinating and terrible to people. So that, you know, that and the severity, obviously, of the process of taking a human life, particularly that of an infant or a young person. That this is why it, you know, this is how the practice came about. The same reason why people gravitate towards blood sport and, you know, other innocuous sublimated, you know, fascinations like that. I don't accept that. I mean, yeah, that's true, but I'd imagine, you know, anatomically and behaviorally modern humans who nonetheless were truly primitive, you know, in prehistory. A man living in the closest thing to a state of nature as we can imagine. You know, back when man still had natural predators, you know, saber-toothed tigers or cave bears. Or, you know, like in the Michael Crichton story, Ears of the Dead, not quite human hominids who hunt and eat humans. Well, that threat becomes an instantation of a terror god. You know, it's easy to imagine a shaman in a Cro-Magnon tribe donning, you know, like the fur of a saber-toothed tiger, doing some performative ritual, and then offering a baby at the mouth of the cave, because sometimes when the saber-toothed tiger comes, when he's hungry, he'll take that infant away, and then he won't come back because he's sated, and he won't kill everybody. You know, so you're bargaining with God by, you know, the offer of a blood sacrifice. And the process of life and death also, you know, is both compelling and terrifying to humans. And ritual practices, you know, whether you're talking about, you know, something that as innocuous as taking communion. I mean, I take communion seriously. I'm not saying it's trivial, but obviously nobody dies during communion. Or
right, there's all theology aside, there's an order of magnitude between sacrificing your baby and going to communion. Right, we're speaking about different things here.
Yeah, and I'll hand it to you in a second because I realize I've been going on for a moment. But you know, in sacred time, there's it goes beyond these practices being perennial and saying like, okay, when I take communion or when we practice this ritual, we're connecting with our forebears as well as partaking of a divine mandate and command. I mean, there's those aspects of it too, but there's something that is temporally discrete about ritual practices. It takes us out of our it's an ontology unto itself. Okay, and particularly you're talking about the taking of a human life. You know, either by offering an infant to be killed by a beast that threatens the tribe, whether you're talking about a high priest, you know, sacrificing the victim, you know, that brings people into proximate contact with the mortal processes in a way that's not splendidly accidental, as death is when it strikes you down or, you know, your loved ones, your comrades, you know, and that's important because, you know, it familiarizes the process and sacralizes it, and it both sanctifies and like demystifies it at the same time, you know, and all these things are important because first and foremost, people need to be able to go through their lives without being terrified of death. Otherwise, nothing gets done. And I mean, that's a spiritually and psychically unhealthy way to exist. But, you know, there was all these functions. But so to bring it back, okay, Christ obviously representing Logos incarnate, you know, subjugating passion and will to reason, which is logos, strips, it strips tyrants of their ability, to lay claim to godhood. Okay. It also enforces a civilizing mandate on the lower orders who are prone to sacrificing human beings and things to placate, what they perceive as divine forces and manipulate such things in their favor. Okay. And that changed everything when that happened. And that's also why some of the most sanguinary crusades were against the Baltic pagans and things. Saracens had like an incomplete understanding of God, and they were somewhat barbaric people, but they weren't sacrificing human beings to some terror god. Okay, there's a difference there. And one represents a far greater threat to basic civilization than the other. But yeah, I realize there's a lot there, man. I'll hand it to you for a minute. It's your show. Literally.
Yeah, so there are several things there, right? I'll admit I'm by no means a classicist, but in the Greek canon there are the concept of human sacrifice is sort of interesting because it's a major taboo among the Greeks, right? You have Tantalus, right, who is forever tormented in Hades for human sacrifice, right? I don't remember the details, but I think he cooked and ate a human. He was condemned to be forever hungry and forever thirsty. Or even kind of more presciently, right, you have Agamemnon, right, who is in this sort of tragic situation, forced to choose between, sacrificing his daughter and, the dissolution of his state. And obviously, Agamemnon is very much a tragic figure, right? He comes to a bad end. So there's this idea that this is maybe perhaps in some situations necessary, but an ultimate taboo, right, is seen as, next to perhaps, violating hospitality, very much, kind of putting you outside of the scope of civilization. And it's also been interesting recently. Social media is bad for you. It rots your brain. But I did pick up on, and this has more to do with the pathological leftist obsession with the defeated and the underdog. But a conversation of Rome versus Carthage came up, right? And of course, you have all the progressives coming out saying, oh, Carthage was secretly this, progressive paradise, and then the evil fascist Romans came and got them, which is, of course, stupid, right? This is not a real discussion. It's political in nature. But of course, it came up the conversation around, Carthaginian human sacrifice, right? Which you read in the Roman sources, them saying, this is completely and totally unacceptable. These people are not civilized. And in the Bible as well, right? You hear of this ritual of, passing your children to Baal, right?
Yeah,
which is,
the Canaanites
burning them on the
Baal.
arms of the altar. Yeah. And you're right to say that this is a very deeply, deeply buried human instinct. My general goal for this is not for me to, go on a tinfoil hat rant about demons, although it may come out. But one of the things that I think about, and I'm glad that you brought up Christ's crucifixion, because in sort of a symbolic religious sense, that is the ultimate sacrifice, right? The most precious thing sacrificed in order to, kind of like heal the great cosmic wound, right? To bring all things right. And we see two versions of that, which is one, this is the most perfect human sacrifice possible, right? It is the sacrifice of, a fusion of God and man, right? The kind of most perfect version of that could be done. But also, right, it negated the necessity for Old Testament style animal sacrifice, right? Slitting the throats of, bullocks and lambs and all that. And one of the interesting things that happens there, and you read this in contemporary Jewish sources, is, after the temple curtain is ripped, right? Christ says it is finished. The magic of the temple goes away, right? There's no longer a light present. There's no longer anything votive, anything pushing it forward. And again, digression, maybe we talk about that another day, but that is an interesting way in which, we are no longer in the era of sacrifice in that way. And to me, when I think of, kind of like the visuals of human sacrifice, what really comes into my head is Apocalypto, right? The great Mel Gibson movie, amazing film.
Great film.
Right. And this is sort of chronicling a decadent dying empire, right? And the final scene is infamous as, they're on the beach, chasing this guy down. He's been, wounded. And then, the boat comes onto the shore, right? You see the guys in the conquistador helmets with the cross, and that's where it ends, right? They're putting an end to it. But again, to your point, like human sacrifice is something we find in almost every culture, right? In Mexico, even before, the more advanced empires, there are these sinkholes in the ground, which are kind of like these deep limestone underground lakes, right? Many of them look like you just dropped a cylinder. And at the bottom of them, right, they'll just find, it's an ossuary, right? Bones as far as you can see, thrown in to sort of appease the gods. And to your point, right, there's sort of a like a Whiggish presentism that regards things like that, we're done with that. That's not something that civilized humans do anymore. And to your point about, the Son of Sam case, but also, I think of things like, the Finders cult and others, where it's like, this is still something done. I mean, even look at and this is funny, I think we had this conversation one or two Old Glory conferences ago, but the sort of death cults that spin up around, like narco gangs running through, Central and South America. It's been a while. I don't remember the official name for it, but, at these drug houses.
They worship Santa Muerta.
Mm-hmm.
Literally.
They make these sort of bone totems, right? And people are, ritually murdered. One last case, just to indicate that this is still, alive and active. Tucker Carlson interviewed Nayib Bukele, right, the president of El Salvador. And, the history of MS-13 is sort of interesting because, you have this mix of kind of, Central American paganism with like American death metal culture, which is a little bit bizarre.
They're like what's up rocker guys. That's why they throw out the devil horns. It's fucking crazy.
Right. But that organization, and this is something Bukele was talking about, like, engages in, demon worship and human sacrifice. And when we talk about, when we relate this to the sort of Epstein case, right, it might not be immediately apparent what the connection is. Well, if you look at the obsession with a certain faction of our elite with like extreme morbidity and the occult, right? You look at a guy like Podesta, right? The spirit cooking that was, quite popular for a while. You can look at it two ways, which is one, this is sort of, decadent, sort of, just kind of, social signaling, right? Doing things deliberately to spite the morality of the culture. And there may be something to that. But also, if this were simply one of many ways to thumb your nose at bourgeois morality, well, you'd expect some more variance there, right? Why does it always come back to these motifs and these themes? To me, it indicates that, there is sort of a pull and an attraction to it. So, Thomas, we've sort of done an overview, but where do you want to start more specifically with this discussion?
Well, I think at some point we should take up both. We should break down the Son of Sam case and the murder of Arliss Perry, which are causally connected. It's not. There's a connection beyond the conversations Berkowitz had with Maury Terry. I think we should also take up Paul Bonacci's testimony and some of what was alleged in the wake of the Franklin credit scandal. You know, because the rebuttal to what we're suggesting here, that there actually is like an occultic strain among elites, and it would not be irresponsible to say that it's an active subculture, this kind of thing. Most people who accept that exists, their claim is, well, it's what Bonacci testified to. What they're doing is, and what these people allege, like the people who advocate this perspective on the issue, they suggest too that why so many people, like Epstein's patron Barr, are connected to U.S. intelligence. Is they're like, well, they're like, we don't doubt that people like Bonacci were victimized, but it's basically that the intelligence apparatus, they were experimenting on people to break down their psychic defenses and violate and devastate their kind of inner moral core, for the sake of extrapolating data, much the same way that these LSD experiments would subject people to horrible stressors to essentially identify like what a man's breaking point was in terms of his ability to resist interrogation. And like, I don't deny that. I think there is an aspect to that. Okay. And, but that's not the whole story. And, the reason why this kind of thing is dangerous is precisely because these people actually do believe in this kind of stuff. And I'm always making the point to people that, nature abhors a vacuum, not just in power political terms or in institutional terms. When we're talking about power at scale and how it's configured. In sociological and psychological terms, if you set about to kind of abolish any kind of public religiosity, like, I'm not saying it would be a good thing if there was a more conventional state religion in America that was being employed to kind of expedite the social engineering regime. But the kind of yawning void that is the Nuremberg ideology and its praxis, people kind of instinctively gravitate towards alternative belief structures within that paradigm because there's nothing else. I make the point to people, it's not an accident that I was arguing with somebody recently who claimed that Vladimir Putin was just putting on airs of when he professes his Orthodox faith. He's not. And his parents were very much like occulted Orthodox practitioners. Because in the Soviet system, especially in like KGB and GRU, these guys who were, kind of true believers, they were seeking out some sort of spiritual foundation for their politics and for the trajectory that their lives had taken in service of the Soviet Empire. Okay, like, don't get me wrong, people like Epstein, people like Jimmy Savile, people like Roy Radin, and I'll explicate who Radin was in a subsequent episode. They'd be interested in occultism anyway, because and trying to capture power from these occultic sources and things, just because they're profoundly corrupt people. But the power of that kind of thing is magnified when there's not a countervailing psychosocial tendency at scale towards logos and at least towards practical reason, or at least a general taboo and condemnation of occultic practices. And that's one of the reasons why stripping away of sexual mores, I mean, obviously part of it is just an aspect of Rosenkrieg and social engineering by psychic violence and things, and the breaking of communitarian bonds, attacking the intimate moral core of people. But it's also the kind of energies that are mined from these evil practices and from this kind of ritualized perverse sexuality and violence in the absence of cultural condemnation and resistance. This kind of thing, because that becomes exponentially stronger, and that's one aspect of regime social engineering and the ripping away of taboos and social prejudices that can't be denied,
Yeah, well, and it's, you see this in the sort of trajectory of, I guess you would say, like, liberation, right? That there is sort of a momentum to that entropy, right? First comes one, then another. And it's kind of lampooned as the slippery slope fallacy. But also...
No, you said it better than I did. Yeah, that's what I was getting at.
You're also habituating the ruled to sort of violations of their core instincts. I mean, perhaps the greatest example I can think of was the relatively abrupt change that happened after Obergefell, where once butt marriage had been sort of legally recognized, there was not only a shift in popular conception, right? It went from about 60-40 against to 40-64 almost overnight by legitimation. But also very, very quickly, that wedge, as it was sort of pushed in further, enabled two things. One, on the social front, the front of the war moved, right, to a further place sort of down the line. But also, that opened up to power, right, a whole new sphere for, shall we say, like, politics to be sort of enforced. Because, with all of these, right, as these traditional unspoken bonds are, brought into the legal realm, where there is an apparatus that goes along with it, right, that creates this sort of support system behind it. And so, for instance, in the case of gay marriage, well, all of a sudden, you may have had, certain civil rights bureaucrats working along other lines, right, for women, but it's creating a new venue for that. And that's just the kind of like immediate political level. But again, one of the things that you see with this is this insane hatred and antipathy for traditional religion. And I think a large part of the reason for that is on a, again, just purely political level, that represents a sort of node of resistance, even if it's relatively passive resistance. And so the inclination is, one, to go after it legally, but also to sort of, mock and denigrate it, right? To go after it. And then when you combine sort of the esoteric and exoteric distinction you made earlier as regards ancient religions. And by the way, if you want to read more about this, Israel Sawak's Jewish History, Jewish Religion talks about that exact same relationship as regards, sort of modern, quote unquote, Judaism as well, where, yeah, sure, there is a exterior story told, right? There is a first order explanation and justification for action being taken. But that does not preclude the existence of a kind of deeper or more spiritual motivation behind it. Especially if these people show you a more than merely political hatred or rejection for Logos and for Christ.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that was well stated, and it was more cogent than my own description. So thank you for that. I also, to kind of bring it back to the kind of praxis of elite occultism, I focus on Savile a lot because it's so on the nose. Like I said, the Epstein cases too, and the connection to intelligence agencies and things is kind of a red herring for some people. They view a lot of the transhumanist and occultic trappings of Epstein's world as a kind of a cover or a veneer. Like in Savile's case, he'd literally say, like, I'm a sorcerer, and just kind of like laugh about it. And if you watch some of these interviews, how we always had chunky rings on. Okay, a lot of time he'd be wearing a ring that looked like the evil eye. That was a glass eye he popped out of a corpse he was molesting. Okay? And he'd make comments about how people's eyes are like the gateway to their like inner existence. Like he had this notion he was quite literally like stealing people's souls as he violated their corpus immediately after death. Like this man was a literal necrophiliac. And I'm not trying to gross people out. I mean, that's a fact. But like, you can't tell me that Savile was just kidding or he was doing this as some kind of one-off to satisfy some evil fetish. And he picked this up from somewhere. Savile actually was Irish Catholic, like his background. He was poor during the war. When he was like 15, he got conscripted into the labor force as a coal miner. He came from this impoverished, abusive household. You can't tell me that Savile just, and then he started basically working as muscle for these nightclubs, and like before discos, there were dance halls. Like before there was like 1990 style clubs, there was discos. Before that, there was like dance halls. Where like, and back then, before there was like modern PA and stereo, you literally needed a DJ to like swap the records out and like all night like keep the sound system up and running. So Savile basically went from being like a bouncer, like muscle guy, doorman, to like being a DJ. So you're telling me you're telling me this like underclass, like Irish guy in some shitty industrial town who's like bouncing drunks out the door and like probably like running numbers for like a local organized crime element, that he suddenly got into like esoteric occultism by like going to the library or something. Like, that's laughable. He picked this up from somewhere, and he was always talking about how the unlikelihood of his ascendancy, and he believed that this was because he was accessing some sort of occultic power to like carry him on this path. Okay. And that's something that elites do. They periodically do bring in new blood, as it were. That's essential to all ruling cadres. That's why like Arthurian lore, like in one of the Arthurian legends, like his adopted son ultimately is a harbinger of Arthur's demise when he tries to like outsmart fate by like adopting this baby who's not of his bloodline. Okay, it was not unheard of for royals to like adopt like commoner children. Like it wasn't a regular thing, but it did happen, and for that reason. And the Ottomans, you know, the Mamelukes were often often or men who began their lives as slaves. Okay, and they were given the access to palace life, you know, not owing to, you know, skill as soldiers and commanders, or because, you know, they were able to insinuate themselves close to the Sultan as you know, trusted advisors and things. But you always you need to replenish the ranks with blood from without, like within reason, you know, periodic.
Well, this is something that, and I can't
Bill
remember
Clinton
which
was
one
one
of
of
the.
those people too. But yeah, go ahead.
You even see this in, I can't remember if it was Mosca. It was one of the Italian elite theorists talk about the need for at least some level of elite circulation, right? That, you know, you do need to bring in sort of the upwardly mobile members of other classes, right? Both to provide a sense of, you know, upward mobility and legitimacy, but also to continue to be elite. But sorry, I'll throw it back to you. You were talking about Clinton.
Oh no, I was just saying that like Clinton is a Jimmy Savile type figure, like his background. I mean, I think they have things in common beyond that. Um, and Clinton's a lot. Savile was a lot more sinister. Okay, I mean, Clinton is basically there's not much to the guy. I mean, he's an evil person, but you know, he's debased in kind of the very pedestrian sense of the term.
In the garden variety.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
He's
but
a.
yeah, no, exactly. But Savile and Clinton, their kind of life trajectories, it's like a similar phenomenon. Okay. And you know, there's gotta be I think a lot of people don't understand is aside from the fact that you know, if you create a pointless society that it tends to act as a mechanism of sabotage, not just in terms of posterity, but you know, it tends to sap incentive from any kind of power activity beyond that which states, you know, like a immediate necessities relating to the belly. Okay. And beyond that, you know, something needs to motivate elites who take these kinds of risks and take on these historical projects. Like, don't get me wrong, people like Epstein, they've got a very perverse, figuratively and literally, and incomplete and inadequate, as well as immoral conceptual horizon of history and its processes. But make no mistake, like Epstein viewed himself very much as like a man astride history and engaged in historical processes. Peter Thiel is the same way. I know Thiel's gay, so I mean I have no reason to believe he's as evil as Epstein. Okay, whatever his vices, I don't know one way or the other. But you know, and Thiel notoriously abides this kind of like transhumanist futurism. You know, but to bring it back, you know, this is one of the functions that this sort of like elite occultic subculture serves. You know, it provides it provides a philosophical and theological understanding to frame their conceptual horizon. You know, and ultimately the goal is to become gods, or to at least to partake of something more than human. I'm not comparing the transhumanist cultists to people like Epstein and Savile, whatever their problems are. But you'll talk to people and you run across some, especially among people who write science fiction. And I mean, I wear many hats, but I'm one of the things, I'm a science fiction writer, and people will seek me out from that community, and I'll just kind of listen. I do that a lot anyway. But this idea that consciousness can quite literally be coded and transmuted to other host bodies, organic or technological. So a human consciousness, which is the essence of the human being in this perspective, can simply endure in perpetuity and be like literally immortal. People like Teal actually believe that. They believe that that's not just possible, but they believe that's desirable. And their whole kind of notion is to do whatever they can to partake of this process, to preserve their discrete consciousness in perpetuity, and in so doing ascend to godhood. And in more prosaic and gross terms, one of the things one of the reasons for Epstein's interest in children, and make no mistake, Epstein actually was like a child predator. I know these days it's common to be like, that man seduced a 19-year-old girl. He's a baby rapist. I mean, Epstein actually did like assault children, which is an incredibly evil thing to do, obviously, but it also cuts against basic human instincts. And that's not accidental. There was one of these terror cults on the subcontinent, of which we're all in sundry. That's what like the Tuggy cult was, which was a real thing. It's not just something that appeared in the Indiana Jones movie. But one such occultic sect, their acolytes would do things like lying down with decomposing bodies. This was gross, okay, forgive me, but this is relevant to the conversation. Or they'd like smear themselves with like animal feces and just like sit like that. Because like overcoming the instinct towards revulsion is a way of like either transcending or like subjugating your own humanity, whereby what was previously unthinkable, now becomes possible. So like a man who can overcome, even if he's a very deviant and evil person, if he can overcome that impulse to protect children and deliberately like victimize and destroy a child, he's essentially like stripped away a core aspect of what makes one human. And if your perspective is that humans are weak and I want to transcend these frailties of a physical and temporal nature, but also a moral and psychological one, like raping a child plays into that within the internal logic of this very, very sick and evil perspective. And this is a real thing. This isn't just me like speculating and riffing on things,
Yeah, so there's two things there, right? Because there is both the subject and the object of that abuse. And one of the things you'll realize is that there are sort of these first and second generation people involved in this, right? You can imagine the parents and the children. And to me, we spoke about, MK Ultra, at least tangentially earlier. And obviously the ability to, as you've said, sort of deaden your moral center, right? To sort of transcend human morality in heavy scare quotes. That is certainly something real. And, perhaps there's even a positive way to do that, in the sense that, like, you look at military schools where they practice boxing, or in a previous era, fencing, right? Sort of an inoculation to violence. But in this case, right, this extremity, there's also, the subject of that, right? And the reason I brought up MK Ultra, right, is the idea of, beating down and reforming someone. And obviously this sort of extreme abuse, even in a clinical sense, is recognized for the profound impact it has on your personality, right? In extreme cases, basically, creating dissociative identity disorder, schizophrenia, right? Driving someone completely insane. But, that complication of both being a victim of and victimizer, right? In sort of creating someone deadened to morality. I mean, I think that's something very real. I keep going back to the Finders cult, right? And for those interested in reading about it, there's some really fascinating documents from, I believe, the Port Authority, talking about what they found there. But it was, on one hand, very clearly
a lot of good stuff too. Yeah, go ahead.
Right. And what's honestly, I think the most interesting thing is, I believe, weirdly enough, it's a Washington Post article from the early 90s or late 80s. I think it was 87, maybe, right when it happened. And it's perhaps most interesting because it's very clearly written in a skeptical, neutral tone. But a simple inventory of everything they found there is so, like, it sounds like something out of a horror movie, right? That it sort of, shows it in stark black and white. But you have this mix on one hand of, connection to intelligence, foreign passports, right? Founders of the Finders, which is hard to say, who were deeply involved in intelligence. And also this sort of ritualized abuse, right? The children recounting being forced to, do incredibly degrading rituals, sort of enact kind of black magic scenes, play a sort of like pretend part in human sacrifice, right? Go through that and sort of degrade themselves. I mean, it seems to be very much connected to that. And so, sorry, I'll throw it back to you, Thomas.
Oh no, don't apologize. It's highly relevant to the subject matter. Well, that was that's the whole. And next episode I'll get into Bonacci, because I realize I'm referencing things that people might not be familiar with. That's the claim. Whatever people think about Bonacci, something horrible happened to him. Okay, and I think everybody acknowledges that. His take was that he said that he believes that these people who were victimizing him were elements of U.S. Army intelligence, and people who, in addition to people who didn't have any kind of formal office, but, who were quite clearly insinuated into the late Cold War national security apparatus. His notion was that there was trappings of Satanism and occultism, so that if any of the victims testified to these things, people would say that's preposterous. Nobody does that. That's silly. And also, in the case of younger victims, to draw upon archetypes and symbolic psychological objects and symbols that would terrify people, to add to the trauma of the experience. Because Bonacci's take, and he won't talk about this anymore. I guess he's living a normal life as much as he can out of the spotlight. But people who accept his testimony as true, as well as the man himself, their notion is that this ritualized abuse and things, it was tailored to fracture the human psyche and to facilitate disassociation, to your point. Okay? Because this was also when people, when the APA, as well as myriad medical researchers, insisted that multiple personality disorder was a real phenomenon. I don't believe that it is, but this was the consensus then. So the idea was that if through extreme trauma and physical and sexual violence, including forcing people to, do incredibly awful things, you can create a person who, presumably, according to some sort of programming schema, would be susceptible to mind control. And when the fractious personality capable of these extreme acts was dominant, the original personality and psyche presumably would have limited or even no knowledge of the activities underway when the human subject was under the sway of this fractious intelligence. That seems pretty wild. But there's been documentation of far weirder human experimentation by both, the Warsaw Pact and, the United States, the UK, the Bundesrepublik. Some variant of this was with a very different purpose in mind. The Potetsy prison experiment in Romania. Yeah, a lot of Iron Guard guys were victimized in this way, as well as a Greek Orthodox priest. I can't remember his name right now, but he wrote a really great book, not on that subject matter, but about retaining his faith amidst, all of that entire ordeal. And, he lived to see the fall of the Inter-German border and stuff. I found it rather inspiring. But yeah, forgive me if some of this stuff is scattershot. I'll organize for our next episode. I'll organize data points and explain some of these things I'm referencing in a more complete capacity.
No, it was useful to have a sort of overview at the beginning. To your point about the Romanian torture prison, it sort of reminds me of, a book that you and I often reference, right? Which is That Hideous Strength, where there's this scene where, there is a ritual desecration, right, of a Christian icon, because in that prison, and I've primarily read about it through the writings of, Rod Dreher, who is someone I consider largely to be a complete and total waste of time, but I will give him credit for, bringing this to my attention.
He is a fucking rod. Yeah.
But point is, right, and again, this is not simply, and I put that in quotes, right, the sort of, abuses we see at some place like Abu Ghraib, right, where it's torture, right, it's not morally upstanding, but, it's the sort of stuff you would expect, right, soldiers to get up to. Whereas this was, extreme, right? Corporophagia, extreme abuse towards Christian icons, for sexual
and forcing
behavior.
people to do things like urinate on a crucifix, like things that like just stuff that's just plain weird. Yeah,
right, exactly. And the firsthand accounts from that are certainly harrowing, but worth researching. And I was looking for it earlier. I could not find the name of the priest, but I'll bookmark that for later and reference it in a future episode. But Thomas, we are coming up on the hour. Obviously, there will be more here. We will dig deeper in. This is sort of an introduction, if you will. But Thomas, where can people find more of you and your work?
Yeah, man. Thank you. You can visit my website. It's Thomas777.com. Number 7, HOMAS 777.com. There's like my buddy set it up and programmed it for me. There's like an algorithm where like fresh stuff like pops up my content feed. Sometimes it gets janky, but last time I checked it's working as it should. I'm on social media again. I don't know how long that'll be for because they banish me from there like all the time. But you can find me on former Twitter at Thomas Sear. That's my government name. THOMAS CYR 777. My Substack is where I'm most active. You know, I drop video content there. I drop my podcast there. I drop some long form writing there. It's realthomas777.substack.com. And my novel Steel Storm is serialized there in its entirety. I'm working on this manuscript right now on the international system and the social engineering regime that is baked into that system since 1945. And I'm hoping that that'll be ready for publication this winter. But yeah, that's what I'm up to these days.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the release of your manuscript. And I can't remember, it was maybe one of the first conversations you and I ever had, 2-3 years ago, 300 episodes ago.
Yeah.
Was about your book. And
right, yeah,
that book has stuck with me for a long time. It's kind of funny, as I'm sure you have a similar thing. I read it all in one sitting, and I remember exactly where I was sitting when I read the whole thing. Good memory nonetheless, well worth your time. And actually, I think the copy I own is actually from a mutual friend of ours, and I have been holding on to it for 3 years. I should probably get that back to him. But anyway,
that's awesome. You've been holding it hostage, but like it's awesome. It's awesome he gave it to you. I know the man of whom you speak, but yeah, man.
Well, it is just funny, and I try to be good about returning books, but certain things just slip through the cracks. And
I do too. I when I'm done reading a book, unless it's something I need on my shelf because it's something I reference all the time in like my writing, I generally like give books to people. And I know for a fact like half of those books aren't coming back to me, you know. It's all good.
Well, anyway, I will be sure to link all of that. As far as my stuff, Thomas and I's shared show, Radio Free Chicago, where we talk current events, is proceeding apace. I got really good feedback on the last episode. People really liked it. It's actually funny. A mutual friend of ours, who I will not name, from the UK, was actually talking about our analysis there. Which is something I'm looking to get into, is to sort of do a deeper dive into the narrative crisis in the UK. But you can check that out. Link in the description, Radio Free Chicago on Gumroad and Substack. As far as my stuff, the Jay Burden Show is available on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. If you want to support us, you can throw me a few bucks and you'll get the episodes early and ad-free, or check out our sponsor, Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching. Thomas, again, it was great to have you on, man, and I'm looking forward to this series.
Yeah, man. Likewise. Thank you, buddy.
And everyone at home, keep your head up. Life can't last forever. Good night.